Transitioning from Windows to Linux is generally thought of as a pretty difficult process, especially since you can't transfer a lot of your applications over. So I'm going to tell you about my transition and how it went overall. So long story short, I've been using Linux for 5 years. In fact, as you can see here, I'm still currently a Linux user as well. And yes, while I have bounced around from distribution to distribution and I have settled on Arch now, there were still reasons why I left Windows in the first place. So when I built my first PC, which is actually the same PC I'm currently using, I've just upgraded a couple parts. I actually thought long and hard about if I wanted to actually install Windows 10 on it or if I was going to make the plunge into Linux. And since this was my first PC and I was a legacy Windows 7 user, and from what I understood at the time, Windows 7 could not run on the modern AMD x86 chips. At the time it was a 3600 and there wasn't official driver support on it, so from what I understood then, Windows 7 wasn't really an option for me. So I had the choice between going to Windows 10, which I absolutely hated, which is why I was a 7 diehard, or I could try jumping to Linux, and at the time it was Ubuntu 20.04 is what I jumped to. And since I really didn't have a workflow or like I like to think then that I had a workflow, but looking back and now, I really didn't really have much of one, which is why the transition was easier for me. But for those who especially heavily rely on Microsoft Office, I mean, some of that stuff can be transitioned over, and my camera feed's now glitching. Okay, well, I'm going to fix that. Give me 1 second. All right, now I'm back. That should fix it, hopefully. Hopefully it doesn't glitch like that again. Anyway, yeah, that doesn't normally happen. For those who are wondering, that doesn't really normally happen. That just some things need to be reset. It's fine. What you seen was not a Linux issue per se, more of a jank camera setup issue. If you have like a proper camera and a proper camera setup, that's not something I don't think you'll ever actually have to deal with, but I do not. I have a jank setup, so it's a temporary solution, not a permanent one. Moving on, as I was saying, there are certain tools such as Microsoft Office and the Adobe Suite, which you just can't utilize on Linux. You have to use alternatives. For Microsoft Office, I don't think it's as bad because some people transition to using Google Docs. Other people transition, such as myself, I transitioned to LibreOffice. And well, it wasn't just LibreOffice. I was also in the process of transitioning off of Excel in the first place into Python Pandas because Excel just couldn't handle the amount of data I needed to process. But that's just with Office. What about something like the Adobe Suite? That's where things get a little more complicated. So a lot of people go, okay, just use GIMP instead of Photoshop. And I'm going to agree with the Adobe community here. GIMP is not a replacement for Photoshop. Even I agree with that on Linux. In fact, I don't even think I have GIMP installed on my system. Personally, I don't think there is a all-in-one solution that can properly replace Photoshop like that. Personally, since I didn't have a workflow, I kind of got to build my own unique experience. So personally, I use Krita for all my thumbnails and all my image editing, but I noticed after trying to do certain things like create vectors, like yes, it can do basic vectors like rectangles and squares, but when I try to do something a little more complex like a star, I generally realize that I'm going to need another tool on the side of Krita to make those vectors and then import them into Krita. And for that, I use Inkscape. If I need to make like a more complex vector, and I still suck at making vectors, I will jump into Inkscape to produce that vector, save it as an SVG, and then I'll import that SVG into Krita and then resize it and do whatever I need with it. As I was saying, there is no one true proper replacement for Photoshop. I wasn't even good at Photoshop. The last time I actually used it was when I was a kid, and Photoshop was hailed as like the almighty god at that point. Another Adobe tool that people will find it difficult to move from would be Adobe Premiere. There are other video editing tools on Linux. We have DaVinci Resolve, for instance. The issue with DaVinci Resolve is it's not necessarily a free tool if you want like all the codecs. Then again, some of you would also argue Adobe Premiere is not a free tool either. So, I mean, there is a free version of DaVinci Resolve. Personally, when I looked at DaVinci Resolve, I looked at it and I was in the process of migrating off of NVIDIA in my NVIDIA GPU for completely separate reasons. But DaVinci Resolve is really optimized for CUDA and NVIDIA GPUs. And yes, DaVinci Resolve does support OpenCL, but it performs best under CUDA, and I didn't want to have a worse experience because I was moving to AMD. So I was looking around and I settled personally on Blender. The reason I settled on Blender is because they showed interest in, and yes, I know this is kind of gambling on a bit of a hope and prayer, is because the development team behind Blender showed interest in eventually making the video sequencer VSE hardware accelerated on the GPU. But it's not just the fact that they were interested in making it hardware accelerated, it was what they were doing elsewhere in the program as well. How they're moving off of OpenGL and they're experimenting with Vulkan. That kind of gives me hope that instead of using CUDA or HIP or one API to add hardware acceleration to the video sequencer, I have hope that they're going to utilize Vulkan instead for that. So if they went and used Vulkan to add hardware acceleration for the video sequencer, I'd be able to use any GPU that was competitive basically. Any GPU that supported Vulkan, which is all three companies, and I'll just pick the best one price to performance, or if I have the no, I'm not gonna buy a top of the line GPU. If it looks good and it performs well and I feel like the price is acceptable, I'll purchase it. I don't think I'm ever going to buy a 5090 or anything of the sort. Like, I want to be able to utilize whatever GPU I have in my system at the time. I don't want to be locked by this framework made by a company, whether it's NVIDIA, whether it's AMD, or whether it's Intel. I don't want to be locked to their model of graphics cards because none of the other vendors support their framework for accessing hardware on the GPU. And now that I've kind of built my entire workflow around Blender, I think I'm just going to stick with it. Even if they don't add GPU acceleration, I really like the interface and I really like how I can just modify animations, though I do have like certain gripes with how I was messing with like the animations on the volume on sound and sometimes it's just kind of like a few frames off for some reason. I'm not really sure. Anyway, there are tools and there are alternatives to what you would use on Windows, but the thing is, you have to be willing to basically change your workflow or invent a completely new workflow if you are already using those tools and you already have something established on Windows.